Vice President Fielder's here. Can I get a thumbs up if you hear me? Thank you.
Do we have any other commissioners on at this point?
Vice President Fielder's here. Can I get a thumbs up?
Like deja vu all over again. All right. Any other commissioners on besides Vice President Fielder?
Annie Bukacek is here.
All right. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Commissioner Pinocci, are you on? I know Commissioner Pinocci will be joining us. He just called me about 10 minutes ago. Commissioner O'Donnell? All right. Well, time awaits no commissioner. All right. Good afternoon. Time is now 1:02 p.m. This meeting is called to order. I am President James Brown. I am the presiding officer for this informational meeting. With me today are Commissioners Bukacek and Vice President Fielder. They are joining us remotely. As I stated, I believe Commissioner Pinocci will be joining us as well. Commission staff are also present in the room. Today's date is March 6, 2024. This meeting is being held in Helena, Montana in the Bollinger Room, the Montana Public Service Commission. It is also being live streamed on the Commission's website. A recording will be available online after this meeting concludes. As stated on our public notices, this is the scheduled public meeting to hear from NorthWestern Energy on its operations during the January 2024 cold weather event. We'll begin today by hearing from NorthWestern, then moving to questions from the Commission. Finally, before we conclude this meeting, we will provide an opportunity for public comment. As a reminder to everyone in the room today, as well as those listening online, Commission will not be taking any formal action today. Again, the purpose of this meeting is to gather information about the 2024 cold weather event. By way of background, in September of 2022, the Montana Public Service Commission initiated docket number 2022.09.087, which was to investigate resource adequacy and risks, the electrical supply of the state of Montana. In its notice initiating that 2022 investigation, the Commission requested input from interested stakeholders and the public on whether typical approaches to evaluating resource adequacy were sufficient to ensure the Western region can reliably serve customer demand. On January 30th, 2024, the Commission determined that the recent severe winter weather event that affected much of the Pacific Northwest and beyond provides an opportunity for the Commission to further examine resource adequacy and associated risks to Montana's customers. Accordingly, the Commission requested that NorthWestern provide information for the period of January 8th through 18th, 2024. And that is the intro to what we will be discussing today. So, with that said, Mr. Hines, I presume you'll kick us off. Good morning and welcome. Please push the blue button. Good morning. Welcome.
My name is John Hines. I oversee the energy supply component, as well as the government affairs and environmental function. With me today are the individuals who represent the groups that did a whole bunch of work during the cold weather event that we had, in addition to the transmission and distribution folks. But on my left here is Jim Williams. He oversees the thermal and intermittent wind generation in our portfolio. Joe Steinmetz, right to my right, is an individual who represents and oversees the market operations for NorthWestern Energy. And then farthest to my right here is Jeremy Klotfelter. He oversees the hydro generation fleet, which just kind of represents all of the supply operations groups here. So we will tend to want to have a dialogue with you. We very much appreciate the opportunity to present the facts associated with this event. There's been a substantial amount of what I would characterize is false assumptions, mischaracterizations on what our fleet actually did. And this gives you an opportunity for us to have a dialogue and to present that. In order to facilitate what I'd call a interaction conversation with the commission, we only have 4 slides, which is pretty much unheard of for a Northwestern presentation, and hopefully that will allow us to have the dialogue. In addition, I would prefer questions at any point in time that commissioners have questions, and it won't bother us, so please feel free to do so. I believe that one of the big events that came out of this cold weather was speculation that Northwestern had 0 hedges associated with our portfolio. It originated in a newspaper reporter's article on the event, which was then pointed to a specific commission order that allowed us, back in 2021, allowed us to do a particular type of hedging. I'd first like to talk about that. Then we'll talk about where our portfolio was during the cold weather event, including the actions on all of our different types of resources. So starting off, I'd like to explain from our perspective what hedging really means. And hedging to us in this type of framework simply means insulating customers from either reliability concerns, in other words, having sufficient amount of generation available to serve our customers, or insulating them from financial repercussions. Note that I didn't say that it eliminates customer risk in these sort of circumstances. Rather, hedging mitigates, partially offsets, insulates. That's the framework with which we operate in. So bottom line, did our portfolio have hedging in place during this weather event? I can just say, I can't say it any more clearly with resounding yes, we did. Northwestern's portfolio actually consists of physical hedges, financial hedges, a combination of those two, and those were in place during the event. Now, there is a reasonable dialogue to have about the amount of hedging that was in place. Should we have more hedging? I believe, as I described, what we think is a necessary fix to this is that we probably should have additional hedges in place. And we think owned generation, the additional coal strip contribution and the additional Yellowstone plant contribution will substantially alter our portfolio and significantly reduce further financial and or physical reliability risks to our customers. So did we have the tool that was set forth in the article about that we didn't use, didn't implement? That was the tool that the commission approved through an order, like I said, in 2021. And it allowed us to go out and do month ahead or longer physical transaction hedges if our portfolio's forecasted load was less than our forecasted generation. If we could go to this first slide. Charlie? Just to give you a little bit of a background on this, on all of my discussion here today, we're talking about average generation, average load. And so there's different metrics. I acknowledge there's different ways to describe all of the different asset contributions and asset operations, but I'm starting off with a fairly simplistic way of looking at it from an average perspective. The chart here, we look at it from a month ahead basis, both December, January, and also where we were in February. And it clearly, the black line shows what our load was forecast to be in those months. Then the stacked resources show what our forecasted generation was available for those months. It clearly shows that our forecast generation was greater than our forecast load. And a simple reading of the order's criteria, which states you can't enter into a hedge unless your forecasted load was greater than your forecasted generation. So the criteria associated with that clearly wouldn't allow us to do that particular hedge. And just as a side comment, we have a risk management policy, an internal risk management policy, and this criteria that the commission adopted is actually pretty consistent with our internal criteria as well. We're not allowed what we call speculative trading, taking down more power, fixing power prices in greater excess than our peak load contribution. So none of us in the utility or the Public Service Commission or the Consumer Council, which I believe was an advocate for that criteria, none of us want to be in a speculative position, and that criteria keeps us from being in a speculative position. So over those events, 4-day events, we had approximately 1,030 average load. Again, I'm using averages throughout here. So 52% of our portfolio was hedged through own generation and a PPA, a power purchase contract that mimics a gas generation pricing, and that was for 100 megawatts. So we had 52% of our portfolio both physically hedged and financially hedged. Again, it doesn't create no risk for the customers, but it kind of puts a ceiling on how much risk is available. Second piece is 23% of our portfolio was capacity purchases or long-term index prices. What that means is that another 23% of the portfolio was physically hedged for those time frames. So we're at 75% of the utilities portfolio on average was hedged from a physical perspective then. Then the next piece was that's 25% of our portfolio was met through day ahead and real-time power purchases. They're neither physical nor financial hedges. Now, you've heard us say in the past that we don't have a hedging problem, and I don't think we do. What I think we do have is a problem addressing this tremendous amount of intermittent generation in our portfolio, or we also have a significant amount of load variability. And that load variability is difficult to forecast very far in advance. So those two pieces, and if we could go to the second slide, please. This actually shows how our portfolio operated during the cold weather event. And it shows actually market prices as well during that cold weather event. You'll see that the thermal in the gray operated pretty consistently. We did have a maintenance issue at Colstrip that got addressed. We had a reciprocal sharing agreement, so we were receiving at least 111 megawatts of Colstrip power during that event. And the tube leak fix was finished on Friday morning. It was expected to be finished the Thursday morning. Remember, the cold weather came in Thursday night, and it started becoming settled into our service territory on Friday. Friday evening, Saturday, and Sunday were the coldest days of the event. The unit was fully available Friday evening. We didn't dispatch all 220 megawatts of it. And we'll also note that we didn't dispatch a few other resources for the full amount because they're providing other necessary contributions to our portfolio, ancillary reserves, if you will, being able to ink up reserves, those sort of things. So while they might not have been producing at 100%, we needed that product to serve our customers. So in my mind, it was available for 100% and it was providing value to the portfolio. So wind and solar, as you can see, that was available especially wind was available at the beginning of this event. That actually was greater than our portfolio need, and we were able to sell off into the market at that point in time. But look at where the market price was during the beginning of the event. It was very low. When wind started going down is when market prices went significantly up. And for the next 3 days, basically, we had zero intermittent generation. And remember a reference point, we had 1,030 megawatts of average load. The peak load or the peak capacity that this intermittent generation could have provided was around 620 megawatts, nearly over half of what our average load was. But in general, it produced, I believe, around 38 megawatts, Joe, around that amount.
On average, I believe that's right through those days.
So even if we'd have had, the RAP provides a resource accreditation, and that puts a number around 150 megawatts for wind during this winter timeframe. If we'd have even had the winter accreditation number applied to the wind, we'd have had 63% of our portfolio financially hedged as opposed to 52%. But did we know it was going to be available or not? No, we didn't until just beforehand. And that's a critical piece with the uncertainty that intermittent generation provides our portfolio. We don't really know the precise hours that it's going to be available or when it's not going to be available. We also understand that at certain times, forecasting may indicate it's not going to be available and it's there, and also vice versa. And I'm going to skip the next slide, Charlie. If you could go to the last one there. This is an event. The 2022, we had an event similar to what we had this year in December of 2022. Wind showed the same amount of production. It didn't appear during the event. January of 23 was another forecasted very, very significantly cold event. But look at what wind did during this event. It did appear, it did perform very well. And what it did ended up doing is driving market prices down, not only just for us, but it was available throughout the Northwest. And so market prices didn't appear. And that's what makes our forecasting very difficult. And it also makes it difficult for us to justify going out and buying a whole bunch of additional generation. We don't know if it's going to be needed or not during these kind of events. So it truly is an uncertainty with our load, but it's also an uncertainty of whether the intermittent generation is going to appear or not. Our takeaways on this is that there's significant volatility both in the forecasting of it and what the market prices are going to do. When wind does not appear either in our service territory or in the region, market prices tend to go up significantly. In fact, the Bonneville BA, they showed almost zero wind, as well as similar to what we saw in the January event. And that helped drive us to basically pricing that we hadn't seen since the 2001, 2002 upheaval in the energy market in the West. And the other thing I'd mention here, as far as the forecasting, the severity of the weather itself was changing daily, almost hourly at times, where it became increasingly more severe and also increasingly more widespread. If it had been only located in Montana, for example, the West Coast would have been able to, with production, would have been able to stabilize some of the generation pricing out there. Would they most likely not have this low pressure event? The other piece is that this cold weather event also was in Canada, which they had an emergency alert on their system up in Alberta, which they actually curtailed transmission of generation out of Alberta for hours in order to stabilize their grid. So the geographical piece of this became increasingly more severe as we got closer to the event. And anytime there's uncertainty, the market resolves it typically through higher prices. All utilities, I believe, were concerned about their ability to meet load. And so they are unwilling to, even if they had excess generation, most of the utilities, if not all of them, were withholding generation in order to protect their own customer base during this time frame, which also drove up prices significantly. So in conclusion, our takeaway from this event is that we continue to need additional on-system generation that we have control over, that's available 24/7. And as we've shown this number previously, if we'd have had the Colstrip incremental 220 megawatts that we'll be accepting in 2026, and the Yellowstone plant that we believe will be available for us this summer to meet RAP conditions, it would have saved customers around $32 million compared to market purchases. And that's assuming gas prices at the point in time during that event for the Yellowstone piece. a significant benefit to our customers. And the other thing with dispatchable generation on our system is if the market actually is lower than our dispatch costs, we'll take advantage of the market. If we have more generation that's dispatchable during those kind of events, and we call it the spark spread, if we're able to take advantage of value from our generation and generate even more than what our portfolio needs, then we're able to provide those revenue credits back to our customers. Second, or kind of the last piece on our takeaways here is that the Western Regional Adequacy Program, which we hope to be consistent with beginning in 2026, it dictates that you have enough generation or power purchase arrangements using their resource accreditation policy to meet your forecast load. But in addition to that, they have what they call a reserve margin. So it's basically incremental amount of power available to meet customer loads, recognizing that not everything performs 100% as you expect it to. And this cold weather event illustrated that even on our system. I mean, we had outages at our thermal plants. We had an outage going into the event on our coal plant. They were all addressed in a very expeditious manner. Even from the hydro side, we had icing on the river. The river, when you ice it up, and it iced up at the very last minute as opposed to earlier or later, it degrades the amount of generation that's capable of being produced. So we acknowledge that nothing works 100% of the time, especially in these type of events, and having a reserve margin does protect our customers in a much more beneficial way. Maybe pause here for a moment, President Brown, just see if there's any questions at this point.
President Brown, a point of clarification, please.
Yes, Vice President Fielder.
Mr. Hines, we're looking at slide 4 on the screen, but I think you've been talking for the last several minutes about slide 2, this event, correct?
That's correct, Vice Chairman or Vice President Fielder, both slides 2 and 3. The third slide is the December 22 cold weather event, and it parallels or mimics the January 24 event. The 24 event was more severe, though, for a couple of reasons, and it impacted our system. One, it was a longer overall duration.
Mr. Hines, excuse me, can we just flip back to that slide then? If we're going to be speaking about that one, that would be really helpful. Because I'm seeing number 4, and that's kind of unrelated.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Okay, so this event was longer in duration. And this isn't really illustrated in the slide, but it is from our weather data that we provided. It's kind of an awkward way to say this. I don't know a better way though, but our highs for the days were actually record lows in a lot of locations, which meant our system wasn't able to recover during those events. At other cold weather events, during the day, it might warm up to 0 or even 10 above. And that wasn't the case. We had negative temperatures in a lot of locations for even the warmest part of the day. And that was very unusual for our system. Nonetheless, our system did react to it favorably. And again, we have the people here who actually were out chopping ice out of the river, or their people will, or people knocking on engines to make them turn over during the minus 45-degree weather. But now, Commissioner Fielder, if I may just go to the next slide here, which shows you the December 22 event. You see the same similarities, that the load, which is in the black line there, significantly exceeded our resource portfolio during the key event time periods. And you also saw what our you can see what our intermittent generation did from both the solar and wind perspective during those key weather events. As you see our load decreasing, that's when the high pressure was moving out of our system, and the wind generation picked up significantly. As we all know, living in Montana, when typically when we have a change of a weather, it's accompanied by a pretty significant wind event and we saw that on both sides of those events. I hope that helps clarify, Vice President Fielder.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. God, I apologize.
That's all right. I'll go by chairman or president. I'll go chairman, president, if you'd like.
Mr. President, just really quickly go through some of the resources that were on our system at that point in time.
Before we go there.
Mr. President,
Oh, Commissioner O'Donnell, I think
Mr.
I was just about to ask the question that you're probably going to ask, Commissioner O'Donnell.
oh, okay. Yeah, before we move on further in this, you referred to a regional dearth of wind generation, and that was of concern to me. And I've thought for some time that the RAP program, which is a regional resource, that if there's a regional lack of generation, that would impact the program to where it really wouldn't be that successful. It seemed to me that that's what you were referring to. Is that correct?
Before you answer that question, Mr. Hines, what the first question I was going to ask is for the consuming public that's watching this. Can you explain what the RAP program is?
Certainly, I apologize.
Oh.
So RAP is the Western Regional Adequacy Program, and it's designed to allow more economic use of all the region's resources. It's also designed to ensure that each individual utility has sufficient resources available dedicated to themselves so that not any utility is leaning on the whole or any other particular utilities. And that piece is frequently overlooked, that latter piece. It's critical. Each utility and the RAP program itself gives the utility what they believe each resource should be accredited at. So resource X might receive an accreditation of 98%. That means we can, out of a 100 megawatt plant, we can attribute 98 megawatts of that to meeting our adequacy program numbers. On the other hand, they might give another resource 22%. So that would mean that even though there's a 100 megawatt capacity resource, we can only count 22 megawatts of that toward us being able to meet the RAP criteria. And the important piece with the RAP criteria is that we have to not only equal some of those accredited resources, equal what our resource forecasted need is, but we also then have to have a reserve margin in addition to that. And it's not just NorthWestern. Every utility has to have that in the region. So to Commissioner O'Donnell's question, in theory, that having the sum of all the region's generation will be sufficient to meet a resource deficit like that. In the instance that we've had two of these really severe events, it would have stressed the system significantly given how the resources performed throughout the West. In the January event that I showed in the last slide there, actually the region had significant amount of generation as well. So it wouldn't have been stressed. Montana had more wind than we forecast, as well as the region. The key piece here from a NorthWestern perspective is that we have to have sufficient generation in our system, for our system, I should say, plus the reserve margin. But if our resources dispatch at a price higher than what the regional pricing is, our customers can take advantage of that. But it's frequently overlooked that you have to have the actual resources dedicated to your system, whether it's through a PPA or your own generation, in order to participate at all. If you don't have that generation or PPAs, you can't participate, and you probably have penalties as well. I don't know, Joe, you have anything to add? Joe's our resident expert on regional activities.
No, John, I think you covered that pretty well. I guess the other thing that I would add there is this was a multi-day event and it was Northwest wide. And it was a stressful event for many, many utilities in the region. We did get through the event without a loss of load, at least without a loss of load due to lack of resources. But the pricing that we saw in that market, I think, are indicative of the very, very tight margin between the total amount of generation that's available and what the load was. And so it definitely is a concern that the region has a very narrow capacity margin. And that's why it is important for us to have on-system resources that can meet our load plus a planning reserve margin.
President Brown, the other thing I'd add with the reliability piece is that the National Electric Reliability Council, in fact, I think I footnoted it in my cover letter to the commission on this event, is noting increasing reliability concerns. And NERC is looks at from the entire nation's perspective, but also specific geographical areas. And they've noted that Montana is part of an area that they see increasing concern on reliability, and the loss of load factor is increasing in part because of load growth, but also in part because a lot of reliable generation, 24/7 generation, is being retired without adequate replacement. So that just kind of furthers what Joe's point is that there's increasing concerns, and we're seeing it in the availability of supply being offered and also the pricing of supply during these kind of critical events. And NorthWestern is in a kind of a unique event where we have excess energy over the course of a year. That means if you sum up the number of megawatt hours our system produces, it's greater than our energy load, but it's the timing of when that generation is available. And if we can ensure that it's available, that's what's most critical to us, because those critical weather events, when it's 45 degrees below zero, we absolutely need to be able to keep the lights on. So I'm going to just switch really quickly here to a high.
Before you do that, John, let me, Commissioner O'Donnell, did you have a follow-up to this line of questioning?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Excuse me. I did want to ask, as far as you know, within the region, did anybody, any utility face a situation where they didn't have enough generation to meet their customers' needs?
Commissioner Donnell, I'll give you my perspective, and then I'll let Joe Steinmetz provide a little bit more. I'm reading just from what I've read in the clips from various utilities. Several of them were what they call an N-1 conditions. They were one condition, one adverse effect away from having rolling blackouts. With that, turn it to Joe.
No, I think that's exactly right, John. I know there were a couple of entities that were in system emergency conditions on their own systems. But my understanding is that all the entities in the Northwest were able to make it through the event without shedding load.
The other point I'd make is that the province of Alberta was in a energy emergency, and they curtailed all exports out of Alberta to ensure that their system as a whole had enough generation available to meet its citizens' needs within that locale. And it did affect one of our power purchase arrangements for some hours, not a tremendous number of hours, but it did affect our ability to get delivery of that power out of Canada.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hold on. Vice President Fielder, any questions at this time?
I do, and it would be really helpful since we're talking about the January 2024 event, if that is the slide that's on the screen, because it's kind of difficult. I understand the importance of comparison with the other slides and everything, but I'd like to keep that January 2024 event slide up unless we are talking about the other one specifically at that time. So my, just to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly, the black hashed areas represent the areas where Northwestern had to make short-term purchases to acquire the energy that was necessary to meet load during this event. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And based on your comment, where you had mentioned that had your other resources been available that you're planning to bring online in the future, had those been available during this event, the savings would have been $32 million. Does that mean that those hatched areas represent purchases of $32 million?
Commissioner Fielder, they represent approximately $40 million of index purchases that we made. The contribution of the incremental Yellowstone and the incremental coal strip would have provided about $32 million of offset. And I think the total amount of purchases was around 41 million. Again, I'm looking at Joe, but we also had some net sales during a few of those hours on either end of the bookmark. And so we netted those against our total power purchases. So if you're looking at it from a PCAM perspective, I believe we provide those resources would have provided around 32 million, and net it was around a $39 million total market purchased, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions, Vice President Fielder?
Not at the moment. No, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Bukajek, any questions?
Not at this time, Mr. President.
All right, Commissioner Pinochi, if you're on. All right, John, I've got a couple questions for you. You mentioned NERC, which is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation.
Council, yeah.
Thank you for clarifying. So again, for public consumption, can you explain what the role of NERC is? And just by a way of background, it's my understanding that NERC was created as a result of the Great Blackout on the eastern seaboard in the early 2000s. Can you pick it up from there?
Sure. You're right. They were created out of that very significant power event. They're a subset of the Federal Electric Reliability Commission, and but they're independent, and their role is to look at reliability. They're not concerned about the affordability of a system, and their job is to point out in advance where they're seeing increasing concerns of reliability.
And as a follow-up to that, does NERC impose any kind of prescriptive standards on NorthWestern Energy or other regulated utilities?
Mr. President, I'll take that one. Yes, NERC does have reliability standards that Northwestern and other utilities must comply with. They are typically they span a number of areas, from requirements related to generation and outage reporting and outage summaries, and also transmission related standards regarding balancing, operating reserves, et cetera. So they look at a lot of different areas of utility operations.
And you were kind of headed where I was going to ask my next question. And so can you describe to the commission and the public what exactly a balancing authority is?
Sure. And with the initial caveat that all of us here represent the supply side of the business, the balancing authority area is an area for which an entity takes responsibility of ensuring that all of the generation plus imports minus exports balances with the load in that area. And so their job is to there are reliability entity, and their job is to keep the lights on, the power flowing within that area. And they're responsible for doing that for all the loads, not just the energy supply loads in our balancing authority, but the choice customers and co-op load as well, and balance that with all the third-party generation and NorthWestern generation, along with any imports and exports.
And as a follow-up to that, so as I understand, the NorthWestern Energy plays a balancing authority role, correct? Could you explain that?
Yes, that's right. NorthWestern Energy has a balancing authority area for our Montana system as well.
Is that the entire state?
It's essentially the western 2/3 of the state where our transmission facilities extend. So that area covers all the major areas where we have load, as well as some other areas in the state that are served by co-ops and others.
Thank you. You just answered the next question. So can you talk a little bit about that? So I see today's session is both a review of what happened during the storm, but it also an opportunity for the public to understand how all these pieces fit together. And I think this is where I'm going with this line of questioning. So you would agree with me that Public Service Commission doesn't regulate co-ops in Montana, correct?
Yes.
But that doesn't mean NorthWestern Energy doesn't interact with co-ops in order to provide safe, reliable power to Montanans, even if they aren't served by NorthWest Energy, correct? Can you talk about that?
That's correct. The co-ops are located on our transmission system and within our balancing authority area. Typically, they take transmission service from NorthWestern, so they are transmission customers. And this is outside my particular area of responsibility, but they do take transmission service. And to the extent that there are issues within the balancing authority that cause the system to be out of balance, they can affect all customers regardless of which load or generator or import might be the cause of that issue. So, and that, if I may, I would extend that even beyond the balancing authority to the entire Western interconnection. Issues in one area can ultimately affect other areas as well. And so above the balancing authority level, there's a reliability coordinator that's looking kind of at the entire interconnection to ensure that reliability.
And so, Mr. Hines, I'm going to direct this question to you, but Mr. Hines can weigh in. But Mr. Hines discussed the reserves and the need and importance of those. Can you talk a little bit about how the reserve requirement or margin plays in with what we're discussing, please?
Sure. And maybe I'll start with acknowledging something that can be confusing, and especially if we're not careful about the terminology. There are what I referred to earlier when talking about NERC requirements, contingency reserves, for example, which apply to minute by minute and hour by hour amount that must be held in reserve to meet the NERC requirement, so that when a generator unexpectedly trips offline, there is enough other unloaded capacity that can ramp up and meet that gap. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about planning reserve. When we talk about planning reserve, we're talking about looking forward out, can be anything from months to years in the future. And that's an amount over and above the forecast peak load that an entity carries effectively as a safety margin, because as John mentioned earlier, you don't know when you get into an event like that what problems you might have on your system. Load might be higher than expected, generation might be lower for a variety of reasons, and so you need to plan not just to meet the peak load, but to have extra in your portfolio for those events when some of it isn't available.
President Brown, could I add one piece to
Sure.
that, your question, and that Joe is very correct when we as a load serving entity will have an obligation to have reserve margins to serve our customers. The question kind of is remaining and is out there and also becomes a question of state versus federal jurisdiction is those entities who are receiving product through as a choice customer, where does that reserve margin rely? Where does the responsibility rely from a balancing authority perspective? And certainly from a NorthWestern Energy perspective, there has to be the reserve margin in addition to generation or contracts to meet peak. That's a cost question that has yet to be fully addressed, not only in Montana, but in other jurisdictions as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hines. Any other questions from commissioners before Mr. Hines continues? Seeing none, go ahead, John.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to note I appreciate the questions. This is helpful, hopefully for everybody. I'm going to give you a quick operations summary, and as I noted at the beginning, have the actual experts on all facets of our supply business here that can answer the difficult questions. Our hydro system, just to give you a reference point, during the month of February here, we had an average or a planned amount of output of around 256 megawatts. During the cold weather event, and Jeremy here can add some color to it, we had a pretty significant reduced output from our hydro system. And it was because of the icing that took place, and it took place right during the event. Usually, once you have icing on the river, the output, I should say, goes back up to a no more normal to plan estimate. But because the actual icing of the river took place during the event, we had a pretty significant degradation of output for that time frame. And before Jeremy speaks here, I would like to just note that he had a tremendous number of his people out at the dams in minus 40, 45 degree weather outside with picks and probes knocking ice away from the intake gates during lots of hours during this event. So just want to acknowledge his folks too.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I'd say from overall, from a hydro operations perspective, going into this event, we have good notice that cold weather is coming, and we've been through them before, so we know what to expect. And we do a variety of fairly routine operational checks to ensure that the plants and the dams and the systems and the crews are ready to go. We suspend any non-critical sensitive work. So that could be work that would potentially trip a unit or cause loss of generation in a unit. And we identify all that going into a critical time like this, and we suspend it. And then the event that, just to give more context on what John was talking about with the loss of generation, and this is a phenomenon that we see upstream of Great Falls and below Holter Dam. And basically, when you don't have any ice on the river and you get a cold weather event, you are creating ice and ice cover and ice buildup on the river. And if you've, driven down alongside that stretch of the river during some cold weather, I'm sure you can see a lot of ice. So the water volume that goes to make ice does not get downstream for a time. And the river goes through a cycle where it will create ice cover. And then as the cover is made, then it comes to an equilibrium, and the flows, we're making less ice, and the full flows reach Great Falls. In this particular circumstance, we knew right up front that it could be a significant loss. The water, there's probably three main drivers: the water temperature and the atmospheric temperature, knowing what's coming and how long it's going to take, and then the current ice cover on the river. And there is essentially no ice cover whatsoever going into this event. And we had water temperatures in the low 30s. So it wouldn't take a whole lot of cold to begin making ice. But we're fairly familiar with these events. We've seen them before, and we did our best to forecast and anticipate the load loss and the timing that we would have. Worked with Joe's group in marketing, so they were ahead of that and can plan ahead. And this one worked out just about like we thought. We ended up losing around 90 megawatts maximum at a peak loss, and it came back to full production a couple days after that, once that ice cover was made. Other events, if you have good ice cover going into it, or if it's a more acute short-term event, would be much less drastic. So, and I appreciate John mentioning our guys working hard at Black Eagle. The dam structure is not designed to handle horizontal ice loading. So when we begin to build ice up against the actual dam structure, our guys go out and chop ice and ensure there's water between the structure and the ice. And it's hard work, and they take great pride in it and work very hard to ensure that it doesn't lead to any issues.
Including safety.
Yeah. Yeah. So overall, I'm very happy with how our sites performed through this event and others. There were no mechanical or electrical issues whatsoever. The only loss of generation was not due to an issue at the plant. It was because the water inflows had reduced. So, and as I said, we've kind of learned that cycle, and we communicate as best we can throughout the process.
President Brown, the only comment I'd make to that, and thank you, Jeremy, is that they forecast the degradation of flow and generation very accurately, I would say, considering all the different issues that you have to analyze. And they relayed that information to Joe and his group well in advance, and they were able to take that into account. The other point there is just, again, having knowledge of how resources are going to perform, even if they weren't performing to what we had hoped, provides necessary reliability assurances out of Joe's group. Moving along.
Yep, before you go there, I think Vice President Fielder wants to ask a question.
Sure.
Vice President Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. If they'd like to wrap up this topic, that's fine. I have a question that's on a different subject. So whenever this subject is concluded, I'll move to the next one.
I think he was
Vice President Fielder, we'd be happy to take your question right now.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it would be hard not to be grateful for the very good work of all the men and women that keep our lights on and our homes warm during these times. So we really appreciate those efforts. And I don't think we have a full understanding of how much effort goes into it, but we do know, and I know that there's some very hard and very dangerous and very uncomfortable work that is done to make sure that the rest of Montana is comfortable. So we thank you and the men and women of NorthWestern Energy for that. I just wanted to get a better understanding of this, back to slide 2 again, and that is, it's pretty, this is a great slide, by the way. Whoever put this together did a really, really good job of depicting a lot of information visually, and I really appreciate that. To me, it's self-explanatory what the thermal and the hydro and the wind and the solar areas represent, but we didn't have very much discussion about the capacity contracts and where those come into play with these other resources. Can you just touch on that for a little bit for us, please?
Yes, Vice President Fielder, that's a great question. And a capacity contract is something that we enter into usually far in advance. They can range from 6 months, a year, 10 years even. And it's basically what we call a call, that we are not taking power from those contracts unless we say we need it a day ahead or 2 days ahead. And at that point in time, they will provide us whatever power we have under contract, but we're not only paying a capacity payment for those that power regardless of whether we're making the purchase or not. But when we actually do make the call, we're paying it's typically an index-based price for that power. And so it's a reliability hedge, but it is not a financial hedge. Joe?
If I could add to that, John, that's exactly right. Typically, the energy price is of those contracts is tied to the electricity price index. We do have one of those contracts for 100 megawatts that's tied to a natural gas index. And so that provided in this time a significant cost benefit as well.
Thank you for that. And just to follow up on that, what rate is paid for those capacity contracts, or how is that determined? We've got these, this slide shows us what the market prices were during these different times, but what were the capacity contract prices? How were they set, and how did they relate to the market prices?
Vice President Fielder, so there are two components to the price on the capacity contracts. One is the capacity price, which we pay a fixed amount every month, regardless of whether we take energy. So you can think about that as being, the analogous to the fixed costs of a generator, for example. You pay them whether you generate or not. And these contracts, some of them, the longer term ones, were the result of RFP processes, competitive solicitations we had. Some of the others were negotiated just bilaterally between NorthWestern and the counterparty. So they're negotiated prices. The second component is the energy price. So when we do actually call on energy, we pay for that energy separately. And that, under these contracts, most of them are the market price of electricity as published by one of the index publishers. So they could be at the Intercontinental Exchange or ICE price. That's what's represented on this chart here, the red dashed line. And I believe some of that quantity of capacity contracts is based on that price. Another of those contracts is based on the hourly index price published by a company called PowerDex. So rather than being set day ahead, that index varies hour to hour. And so all those things are negotiated between the buyer and the seller, or in some cases offered into a competitive process by the seller.
Okay, thank you for that. So if you hadn't had those contracts in place, would those tan areas represented by capacity contracts, would those also be the hatched areas where short-term purchases would have been necessary in this instance?
Yes, I believe that's right. They would have been short-term purchases, and that goes back to what John mentioned earlier. There are two components we're trying to address here. One is ensuring that we have the physical capacity lined up ahead of time, and that is addressed by the capacity contracts because those parties are obligated to provide that. We know that ahead of time, and we're not relying on the short-term market for those quantities. But the other component is price. And so if we hadn't had those capacity contracts in place, the price component would have been similar, but the reliability component would have been much worse because that would have been another 350 megawatts that we were essentially relying on that, or relying on being available in the day ahead and hourly markets.
Okay.
Vice President Fielder, with the reliability component that Joe is mentioning, so it's not only a very thin electricity supply market, but then we're relying on a tremendous amount of power being imported from outside the region and with transmission constraints. So there's kind of a double whammy from the risk reliability perspective. The other thing I'd point out is that with the Yellowstone and the incremental tranche of Colstrip, that we will not need those long-term capacity contracts. The generation resources themselves will start backfilling that area. And as I mentioned earlier, when the operational costs are, the dispatch costs for those resources are less than market, regardless of whether we need them as a system or not, we'll be able to run those and sell into the market. And if the dispatch cost is lower than or the market is lower than our dispatch costs, then we won't run those resources and take advantage of market purchases.
Thank you. That helps, I think, with the understanding of this, quite a bit. I guess I have another follow-up question, if I may, Mr. President.
Of course.
Thank you. So the hatched area, where the short-term purchases were made, that is obviously an area of great risk because there was no guarantee that that power would have been available to purchase during that time, is there?
That's correct.
Okay, so it's not just cost that's a concern, and cost is a great concern, but there's a real possibility that that power may not have been there for NorthWestern Energy to purchase.
Vice President Fielder, that's correct. That is the risk associated with relying on that short-term market.
And
Oh, pardon me, go ahead.
do you have any data on how that would have impacted Montanans? Who would have been impacted and to what degree?
We look at it from a little bit different perspective. Vice President Fielder, we want to take actions to ensure it doesn't occur. And that's the approach we've been taking since probably 2017 when we first issued a plan that noted our concern about market reliance.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting and informative to understand what that risk was to Montanans.
I can talk about it from a non-quantitative perspective. It would be extremely devastating for people, especially for those folks in fairly uninsulated homes and reliant entirely on electric heat. Not having that power for 24, 48 hours would have caused extreme negative effects for them. I can't say it much differently without using a lot of adjectives that would probably get me in trouble.
No, obviously it would have been horrible for some people, but I don't really comprehend how widespread the impact would have been. There was still generation occurring, you still had 700 to 800 megawatts online, but we were short by, maybe 300 or 400 megawatts at some points, less in other points. But who would that impact when you fall short like that? How do we know what those impacts would have been to where on the system?
Yeah.
Do we know?
No, Vice President Fielder, I understand your question a little bit more now. And President Brown was talking about the role of the balancing authority. The role of the balancing authority, one of their roles is to ensure reliability. And that means if generation doesn't equal load within like a 4-second interval, they have to take steps. Otherwise, the entire grid can go down. And the steps that are taken if you don't have the generation available is you have to shed load. So if you're 300 or 400 megawatts short, every instant you'd have to be shedding 300 or 400 megawatts of load. Now they have a load shedding from distribution perspective plan, something that we don't ever obviously want to implement, but they try to stagger that impacts across our service territory so that not one particular area would be out for 48 hours, as an example. They'd try to do a cascading events. Now, obviously, the problem with that is even 4 hours at minus 45 has a significant effect on anyone.
Yeah, so is that terminology that you're using, is that similar to what we know as rolling blackouts?
That is correct.
Okay, all right.
Vice President Fielder, could I add also there is one other layer between uh, the inability to find something in the market and that stage that John was just describing of potentially going to rolling blackouts. There are a series, again, provided for within the NERC framework of increasing levels of alert that both what's called the merchant or the energy supply side of the house, and then the transmission provider and balancing authority can enter that put out the word to the region that they're in a dire situation and asking for help. And part of that is the ability to call on contingency reserves. So those reserves that are held by us and by our neighbors as that are part of the Northwest Power Pool reserve sharing group would be dispatched to try to keep that that situation from getting to the point of rolling blackouts. But obviously, we don't want to even get into that portion of of the reliability picture, and thankfully we didn't in this instance. But that's the kind of in between phase that would be instituted prior to going to the rolling blackouts.
Okay, that's
Vice President Fielder, just one more piece here, and it's actually a segue into when I start talking about the gas thermal generation. Gas has a similar sort of concept, only gas transmission, I should say. And when they have instead of having a load fluctuation variance, they have what they call a pressure analysis. And if there's not enough pressure on the pipeline, i.e. either you don't have enough compressors or enough gas, it can't move to the proper places. And then on the gas system, they have different levels of alert, like Joe was referencing for the electric, but they have the ability to curtail interruptible customers. And that did impact one of our gas generators during this event because of the severity of the event caused actually record over design usage of natural gas on our system. And so they did go to they required interruptible gas customers to drop off the system in order to try to repressurize the gas system to serve core customers.
okay. That's very interesting. Thank you. Another follow-up. That is there a similar plan in place for electric side customers? And I know we're talking about worst case scenario, and there's a number of layers of safety nets that you have built in, and that's wonderful. But I'm trying to understand, and I think the public would be interested to know, who goes without power when there's not enough power? How is that done? Is it done by substation, or is it done by individual home or business or school, or do you have a list of interruptible customers? How is that addressed, or how can we find out more about that if you're not comfortable explaining all that for us today?
Vice President Fielder, thank you for that out. And that's a distribution issue, and we'll have Jason Merkel provide you we do have a plan in place. They update it all the time on how you would approach this kind of an event. And it's like Joe said, we never want to do it, but we do have it as part of a plan. And in fact, in a couple of the areas from the gas side, I know that distribution, transmission, and supply were meeting probably a week in advance to address the potential of this occurring in specific areas, and we're putting together steps to take in case it occurred.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, Commissioner O'Donnell, any questions at this time?
No, sir. Thank you.
Commissioner Bukacek?
Oh, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Hines, please continue.
Thank you. So I think we've already talked about the solar and the wind and how they didn't produce during the cold weather event. There is one piece with wind, though, that also has a operational constraint. And that's when the air temperature gets below around 21, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. They automatically shut off. Just the gearing mechanisms aren't adequate to be able to operate during that cold weather. And I'd note that we do have industry best cold weather packages on these wind plants, and they're still not able to operate much at those kind of temperatures. In addition, we as a company, I don't would not want people climbing those towers in those kind of temperatures. Even if they were able to go to lower temperatures, the safety issues are tremendous. Operating at those kind of heights in those kind of temperatures. So, you know, it's not just cold weather, or it's not just a low pressure or high pressure event. It's also a temperature issue that affects them. And the other thing with solar is that it wasn't, you know, obviously it doesn't work at night, and we had our huge cold weather at night, but even during the day, we had pretty significant snowfall in a lot of the areas, which obviously degrades the solar output as well. Now moving to gas thermal, despite certain comments that we've seen from the press, gas generation did perform quite well during this event. And I do need to speak a little bit to the numbers that we've provided. And Jim, I want you to provide more color here. Is that, first of all, we withheld some of the generation specifically at Dave Gates to provide regulation services. Unit 3 was held, a good portion of it was held in reserve to provide that product. So while you don't see the megawatt hours being produced out of there that you do from the other 2 units, it was operational. Second, we did have, you know, the Basin plant is a 52 megawatt gas plant that we have a power purchase arrangement with, and it did get curtailed gas. We don't have a firm gas contract, actually either for Dave Gates or for Basin. We have an alternative, which I'll get into in a moment, for Dave Gates. But Basin was, I think, offline for about 20 of the 96 critical hours because of lack of gas availability. Again, I emphasize that Basin is a power purchase arrangement that we have. Dave Gates also was curtailed from natural gas, but when we designed Dave Gates and built it, we put in an alternative ability to generate with diesel. And kudos to some of the diesel transportation companies in Montana. They did a great job moving diesel to our plant, but we were able to keep it operational during the entire time frame. There was a degradation just because diesel doesn't burn as efficiently as natural gas. So there was a degradation from the 150 megawatts, around 10 to 15%, but nonetheless, it was operational for nearly the entire time frame. And with that, I'll let Jim give you some color.
Thanks, John. And we did have some issues with Dave Gates with some of our water lines freezing. We had some low temperature air going through our generators that tripped us off. But I will say that none of those events kept us off for extended periods of time. I think our longest event was 2 hours and 50 minutes. We had 1 hour or one event that we did have to troubleshoot, find the cause, and correct the issue. And much like the hydro guys, our folks were out there in the cold, making sure replacing oil lines and putting concrete blankets on water lines and getting things warm. We did have quite a few 20-minute events and less, and a lot of that goes to the preparation that John was talking about, understanding what may happen and how this event's going to come in and making sure your inventory and people are prepared for it. But overall, our assets did perform very, very well.
Commissioner O'Donnell, any questions?
No, sir.
Vice President Fielder?
No, thank you very much, though. I really appreciate the presentation today and the graphics that were provided.
I don't think we're quite done yet, but Commissioner Bukacek?
I'll have a final comment at some point.
Okay. Rhines?
President Brown, I'll take Commissioner Fielder's comment as a subtle hint. The last kind of major generation source for our portfolio was Colstrip, And that's also received quite a bit of, I'd say, misunderstanding as to why we scheduled it, when we scheduled it. And just a little bit of background on that. There was a tube leak first found, and these tubes go to the boilers, running water, cooling. And a small tube leak, a very small pinhole type of leak, was identified in November. A couple of more of the prick leaks were identified in December, and in early January, those pinpricks became bigger, and it became pretty apparent that rather than try to run the facility for a much longer time period, that it made sense to take it down and do the maintenance on it. That was originally scheduled for the time frame during which the cold weather event was going to hit. We, as well as other parties, talked with the operator and made a determination that it was better to do the maintenance prior to the cold weather event, as opposed to hoping that the leaks didn't get to a point and their facility needed to shut down during the cold weather event. So the maintenance was undertaken, and it was scheduled to be completed on Thursday, which was the day before the cold weather event. Unfortunately, when they went in and they had to actually go in and torch and cut the pipes to get to where the location of the leaks were, they found the maintenance to be a little more substantive than they originally forecast, and thus the plant didn't come back online until around 6:30 Friday morning. By the time, and it was then fully available for full operation later that evening, and ran throughout the rest of the cold weather event exceptionally well. Again, Colstrip, like unit at Dave Gates, some of it was held back at times for regulation purposes. Again, it's a necessary product. Just like for a car, you need to have both gas and oil. You need to have regulation as well as generation in order to run the power system. And so we had a small amount of Colstrip withheld to provide regulation service during that time frame. So the other point I want to make is that because of our reciprocal sharing agreement that we have with Talon, even when Unit 4 was down for maintenance for those days, we were getting 111 megawatts of power from Unit 3. And if Unit 4 would have been operational and Unit 3 down, we'd have had our unit degraded at Unit 4 by 111 megawatts, because Talon would have been availing themselves of the other 111. So it's a sharing of the shaft risk is how I think of it, and it benefits us. And in this instance, it clearly gave us some benefit on Thursday evening and Friday morning. Jim?
Jim, if I could just make one clarification before you go. The reserves product that we had on Colstrip during that time was spinning reserves, not regulation. So we had to spin up in the event of a contingency. Which means if we had an outage on another plant, or if one of the parties in our reserve sharing group had an outage where that was needed, we would have increased the output up to the full availability.
And really, my only comments go to John's shaft reliability comment, and this is both in gas and helpful at Colstrip, but shaft reliability really played a huge role in this event, because it reduced the amount of risk we had from a generator or any mechanical issue. So by having the way David Gates is set up, you've got two turbines pushing one generator. So if you have an issue on one turbine, you can be troubleshooting and you're only down half of that unit availability or capacity, if you will. And so having that shaft reliability is key in only having a percentage lost if you have a maintenance issue. And when Yellowstone comes up, there's 18 units there at, from 175 megawatt plant, roughly 10 megawatts a piece. If you have an issue on one engine, you're only losing up that 10 megawatts, and you're providing, the other 17 are providing the much needed resources. So I'm a big believer in shaft reliability, especially in these cold weather events, and honestly in hot weather events as well. President Brown, I think that wraps up actually our presentation and
open for more questions and comments as the commission desires.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Hines. I'll start with a question on this topic. You mentioned the operator for Colstrip. Can you delineate who that is?
Talon is the operator of the facility.
So NorthWestern itself doesn't operate the facility.
That is correct.
And so can you explain for public awareness how that operation agreement works? The Colstrip, just
I can give you a
estimation.
very, very high level, and Jim can give you more in depth. But basically, the operator is responsible for the planning of the plant, the operational of the plant. That means hiring individuals. It's responsible for ensuring that the plant operates sufficiently and according to the wishes of the owners. And they collect the fees from all of the owners and apply it to the costs, pay taxes, that kind of thing.
And I'll just add, so there's an operating committee. Talon does put forth an operating budget every year. It's voted on, understand major maintenance that needs to go on. And when issues like this arrive, like the tube leak we talked about, everybody has their input on timing and, hey, we're seeing this, we need you to get in. And ultimately the operator does provide recommendations, and those are listened to, but we do have an operating committee that takes votes on a multitude of things at that facility.
I should clarify, I made a mistake when I said taxes. The utilities pay the taxes.
One of the public criticisms certainly that has been leveled at your company as a result of that January event is that there's an assertion that you didn't properly plan for the cold weather event. Vis-a-vis scheduling maintenance, would you like to address that?
President Brown, I would say that the perception is incorrect. In December, we were confident, given the size of the leaks and how they were basically appearing, that this plant would be able to operate for a while before repair was needed. The leaks increased in severity in early January. Remember, this cold weather event really started on January 11th. And so early January, we had, as an operating group, a decision to make. Do we try to put off the repairs for this facility, maintenance repairs for this facility, and hope it made it through the event, or try to expedite the work on the project and get it done prior to the event? I frankly think that getting it done Friday morning, wasn't optimal. We had planned to have it done on Thursday morning, but nonetheless, it provided very critical 111 megawatts of potential generation beginning Friday evening on through the event.
And as a follow-up on that, certainly I think you've described that there's a planning process for maintenance and operation. That can be done months or weeks ahead of time.
Yeah, and it's actually done, take a yearly look, and then as things come up, there is an evaluation of the current project, current budgets, and all of that, and then decided on then. But for the most part, the day-to-day maintenance activities are just done. I mean, there's a ton of maintenance that just happens that you don't need a vote on, and I won't call them minimal instances, but nothing that, I mean, that's what we pay Talon for, or, that's what their job is to operate the facility. They provide the O&M on the bigger things. Yes. And they alert us, like, for example, in this instance, this is what we're seeing. This is what we'd like to do. What are the issues from all the different owners? And everybody comes to the table and says, we have an issue with this, or we're struggling here, there, or wherever, or this is our perspective, and we flush it out. And in this one, getting it done soon was definitely the right call.
Could I add as well?
That's right. I misspoke. We don't actually pay Talon as the operator, but
If I could add to it, NorthWestern and the other owners typically for an event that involves an outage, and for this event in particular, I know did this, reach out to their market operations folks to see what they're seeing in terms of what the weather looks like, what the forecasted loads are. If there were other outages that we had on our system, that would come into our play in terms of voting on how we thought that we should schedule it. So all the entities are looking at all the important pieces, and I think, generally making very good decisions about when to take the unit off if there is some choice on that. In some instances, a tube leak gets bad so quickly that you don't have any choice about whether you can wait a week or not. In this instance, we were able to choose to take it off on our own schedule.
And I'll add to that too, is it's not just a coal strip thing where we're coordinating with, internal entities and that to figure out when the best time to maintain our facilities are. We do the same at Dave Gates. Granted, there aren't other owners to weigh in, but the internal coordination from market ops, transmission, things of that nature to say, hey, we'd like to take an outage to do this. Does that make sense? It's all coordinated quite frequently.
Vice President Fielder, any questions at this time?
No, thank you, Mr. President.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I did want to ask, again, my concern is quite a bit these days on the regional capacities. And one thing I'm interested in is that when the company has to go out and purchase power on the spot market, I'm wondering about the robustness, the health of that market availability. I'm concerned that if we, as you demonstrated, wind and solar fail to operate in really cold temperatures or at night, that if most of the independent power producers that would constitute the market right there, that if they are increasingly renewables, that would diminish the ability of the market to fulfill Montana's needs. Could you comment a bit about that what's called the market? Is it increasing? Is it shrinking? Is it becoming more renewable based as opposed to base load, and therefore it would be compromised at certain times and not be available? I'm just interested in what's available to, in this case, NorthWestern Energy, in terms of the market when it is needed and unanticipated.
Commissioner O'Donnell, this is John. I'll speak to it first, and Joe will provide a lot more insight probably. But I look at it in a pretty simplistic fashion. We're retiring a lot of 24/7 generation in the region, with the potential for additional retirements in the near future. We're replacing that with intermittent generation that, when available, is very beneficial. When it's not beneficial, it's creating a deeper hole in the power availability in the region. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, NERC is highlighting this area of increasing concern because, once again, of additional load growth, but also retirement of 24/7 generation. And as Joe can speak to much more eloquently than I, we saw power prices during this event that last time we saw this level of power pricing was back in 2001, which was reflecting of a very, very disjointed power market, wholesale power market. And so this does nothing but heighten my concern. The only piece that I'd say that offsets some of my concern is that the operation of the Yellowstone plant beginning likely this summer will help offset 175 megawatts of that concern. And by the way, we did talk about gas constraints on our system. We have a separate gas supply that is going to help offset that risk for the Yellowstone plant.
Commissioner O'Donnell, this is Joe. I'll just add, I think John hit it right. I have a lot of concern about the region and the capacity margin in the region over time. I think it's absolutely critical that we add generation on system in Montana. But to get to your specific question about who are the counterparties here, when we talk about the market, they're a mix. There are a few independent power producers, although as you mentioned, many of them now have wind and solar generation. And in fact, almost all of those resources are fully dedicated to under a long-term contract to specific utility. There are some other IPPs or independent power producers in the market, but many of the parties we transact with are other utilities. And so even in a regional event like this one, the weather doesn't roll through that whole region at exactly the same timing. And so, we go all the way down to hour ahead transactions and intra-hour transactions. And so virtually all the utilities are buying and selling to balance their load. Many of them have a significant amount of hydro storage, and that helps get through these events. But most of our counterparties are other utilities. The other big category is what I'll call energy marketers, just generically. And in that case, I'm referring to entities that might be able to buy power in one region and move it on transmission to another region. So for example, in this event, California and the Southwest were having mild weather. And so they had a lot of exports up to the Northwest during that time. So there were both Southwest utilities who were moving that power up and also marketers who are buying from those utilities and moving it up. But at the end of the day, you need the generation in the ground that's able to be dispatched when you're having that kind of load. And that's an ongoing and increasing concern for NorthWestern.
Any
Well,
follow-up?
thank you. That's my major concern for some time now, is exactly this situation when it's 45 degrees below zero for a sustained period of time in Montana, and whether or not if the cold weather event impacts the region, then if you guys don't have enough power to buy that is reliable, then quite frankly, people in Montana will die. And that is a horrible specter to me. The nation was hypnotized, was transfixed, was shocked and horrified by the story out of Texas when they had their cold spell a couple of years ago over Valentine's Day, of the 10-year-old boy who froze to death in his bed at night. And I want to make sure that doesn't happen in Montana. So with the closure of coal plants in Washington, Centralia, and Boardman, with the announcement by PacifiCorp of the closure of 4 coal plants in Wyoming, Coal Strip 1 and 2 closed down. I think Navajo generation went down. I'm just concerned, as you indicated, about the increasing lack of absolute dispatchable power. And I'm really concerned about that, and I'm happy that you share that concern. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any of you gents want to address that comment, or? All right, Commissioner Lukacek?
I'll have a comment in a bit.
I think this would be the time to make that comment.
Okay, I just want to say I appreciate. Can I go ahead?
You have the floor.
Okay, I appreciate this presentation. Is edifying to us and to the public, and for anyone who's paying attention and cares to learn, your presentation should go a long way to correct the errors in the Montana newspapers. You're using polite understatements when you use phrases like false assumptions and mischaracterizations, and I appreciate you being polite. And Mr. President, if this is not already in the works, I'd recommend we put this presentation in a prominent place on the website.
Noted.
Thank you, sir.
All right, gents, anything in closing?
Again, thank you for the opportunity to come and present the facts. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for your time today on behalf of the commission. Thank you for being responsive to our letter of January 30th. We appreciate it. Seeing no further questions from the commission, we will now move to the public comment period. Commission welcomes public comment on all matters that are on the agenda or that are within the commission's jurisdiction. Is there any public comment this morning? What I will have you do, yeah, would you mind vacating the podium and all right. Good afternoon. Welcome back. Please state, make sure the blue is on your microphone there. All right. Please state and spell your name for the record.
I'm John Herron, Herrin from Helena. I was here yesterday too, so that's why. Thank you, President Brown, and the other commissioners. The one thing I wasn't clear because the screen wouldn't go back for some reason to well, I'm not sure it was the earlier event. Was it 2020 or 2022? But I'm thinking it was 2022 that there was a shortfall and another cold period. And I wasn't sure how much that costs the ratepayers. So to put it in perspective, I understand that this January power needs demand purchases off grid was around $39 million to the ratepayers. I thought it was $11 million in the newspaper, so I was a little surprised it was so high. So unless I misunderstood, how did we get from $11 million in the newspaper to $39 million charged to the
Mr. Herron, we have that slide on the screen for you now.
Oh, that's back to the 2023, was it? No, 2022, yeah. So it looks like to me that it's not shaded in the crisscrossed pattern that it was, but there was a huge shortfall early in that event that Northwest Energy obviously had to buy on the market, and it'd be interesting to know how much that cost us. So as an alternative, I know that the solar and wind are some of those systems have or are planning to have battery backups. And it seems to me that maybe Northwest Energy should be buying or participating somehow in getting battery systems like the Tesla systems, from what I understand, are being marketed all over the world. They're going gangbusters with those. And basically it's just little batteries stacked on top of into these packages, and they ship them out in these big containers. That's something that I think Northwest Energy should consider. And I'm sure they have. Somebody's maybe has looked at this, but what could Northwest Energy do on the grids? And what I understand is that when those systems are put in, and especially if they're centered in the right places, that they have computer software that basically modulates the frequencies, and it does really a huge cost savings for the whole system, and allows the systems to be able to go up and down and be able to handle these short-term things. And if we had 39 million, I think you could buy an awful lot of Tesla systems that would be able to do that. And that way we've got this safeguard. And then Colstrip 4, from what I gathered from the presentation, was just sitting there spinning, but not generating any positive load to the system, just for simple fact that they wanted to have it as a backup. That doesn't make sense to me either. I mean, it's like when you can still buy things, why did we end up paying for out of sight when we got a power plant that was running? The two things don't seem to be compatible. And I understand that they're required to have a backup safety cushion, but it just, okay, we're buying it over on the market. Why couldn't we just have that buying on the market as a backup and had Colstrip 4 producing that 110 or 120 megawatts put into the system, saved us money? So those are the two major buckets that I see. But the other thing that I've done a lot of research into solar. I actually sold my land to a solar collector company in California on the Scratch Gravel Hills, and that large solar farm there is on my former subdivision property that got turned around by the county. The long and short of it is I also invested in solar collecting company down in California. So I'm trying to research what innovative stuff is coming along. And one of the things there's so much information coming out, but two things that struck me really strong is that there's these towers. They're solar collectors. They're built vertical. They take up 5% to less of the footprint that a horizontal solar collecting system is, and that could be placed in near the markets where the generating power is needed, on the edge of buildings or wherever that peak power is needed, and cut out all those transmissions. And is that something that I don't know why Northwest Energy isn't, they seem to be buying from secondary people that go out there with their venture capital people, and they build these solar and wind state systems, and then they sell it to Northwest Energy or the co-ops on contract. It seems to me that Northwest Energy, and maybe they've figured out it just isn't practical. Maybe that once we get the natural gas line in Laurel up and the 15 to 30% increase in coal strip, that they will end up having, the buffer that they need. I guess the third, so that's an issue, is that's technology. Is Northwest Energy looking at systems maybe that can be integrated into it, that actually Northwest Energy could have, or at least promote? The other innovative technology that's come along that I've seen is that there's carbon fibers that can be introduced into concrete, and it makes the concrete harder, but it also can act as a battery storage. And this is, not necessarily commercial yet, but if you can imagine a tower solar collector with a concrete base that's got the storage built right into the bottom of the base of this tower, that you've got a win-win. Is that basically it doesn't cost hardly anything more to put these little carbon fibers that basically they align and they move electricity through them. Now, I don't know how well they perform in a cold temperatures regime. And again, that's innovative technology, but it seems to me that we're dealing with kind of antiquated, particularly coal strip. It's really outlived its life. 1 and 2 are gone, and 3 and 4 are problems because they're so dang old. And this is exactly, so has Northwest Energy provided the PSC with what do we got as far as a reliability for this system? And is Colstrip going to be able to continue? And then my question yesterday I asked is, where's the 70% when Washington and Oregon pull out in 2026? I thought it was 2025, but whenever they pull out, who's going to take in that other 70% of Colstrip, so that and maybe at that time, maybe only one of the units keeps going. Maybe it's 4 or 3, whatever. So as far as the public goes, it seems to me that we should know more about what the future of Colstrip is. I would like to see it closed as quickly as possible and transition to natural gas, for instance, is 4 times less carbon footprint than coal. And if that's true, then we need, and with the global warming that I talked about it quite extensively yesterday, billions of people are going to die. They say by 2100, I think the numbers keep coming down, and it's going to be quicker and quicker. They're saying 2024 is actually going to be 2023 was a record high temperature in the world. 2024 is already shaping up with Texas burning up 110,000 acres and more, burning up of Canada. And then we get the tropical, atmospheric rivers that California is dealing with. The weather is getting more and more variable and wicked, and that's going to change our whole power grid system, so that to my mind, if we could do more grid systems that are basically self-sufficient closer to the demand, would be a real reliability plus for the whole Northwest Energy systems, and that includes Montana, is also includes the Dakota utilities too. So I think, partnering with those two or other, people around that are doing solar, we're saying that it's more unreliable. Yeah, but if they're putting in battery backup, is it really unreliable? And I say, no, it's not. So maybe, and the other factor in there is maybe a 4-day cold snap would exceed the battery storage capacities, so that eventually you would, on day 3 or whatever, you might run out of the ability to help that buffer that out. So those are all questions that kind of come to mind of, okay, how do we look forward? How do we do this in the most, not the cheapest, but let's do it for the environment, is basically try and figure out a way to get Colstrip shut down as quickly as possible, preferably renewables, but renewables with, definitely backup systems that make them allow their peaking contributions to be more evenly spread through the day. And for instance, in a winter day, the solar collectors are running at a peak where basically they die down in the evening as far as supplying power. And but then that's when people come home. So the power peaks of the system go way up. So again, to my mind, some type of battery storage, Tesla systems, whoever makes it the most reliable and best systems, that to my mind would be a great addition to the reliability of the whole system. So that's all I need to offer you, and appreciate the chances to give testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron. Any other public commenters in the room? Public commenters in the room? Seeing none. Mr. English, any other public commenters online? Seeing none. All right. For those that are listening, if you have written comments on this matter, please submit them online at the Commission's website through our REDDI system, REDDI system, or email them to pschelp@mt.gov. That's pschelp@mt.gov. Seeing no further business to come before the Commission this afternoon, that concludes our meeting. Thank you again to all those who participated. For the record, the time is now 2:49 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.